Yeah, okay, this is going to be fun. So, to begin with, hopefully a few people are watching online. Yes, good, we got a few. If anybody online does have questions, go ahead and submit those. I will try to look down at the phone occasionally to catch them. Oh, that's coming out a little dark. Jeff, this is Linda. Okay, that should be a little bit better. I know it bleaches out the screen a little bit, but so just some background on all of this. I was asked there's a group from Sugar Creek that asked me to do this, and so I did. Unfortunately, most of them can't be here today. Hopefully, they're able to watch this online. To those of you who are watching online, the notes for this there's a link to a PDF in the note or in the description of the video, so you can go online and get the notes. I won't actually be talking about most of those notes. Those are there for you guys, just to understand what's going on and have some other background. But this group from Sugar Creek asked me to do this, so we decided a 2-hour run through of early church history. If this goes well and people request it again, I will do more of these, but we'll see, because it is a fair amount of work. For those of you who are watching online, you notice that this is put up on Saints and Idiots, and we're going to be talking about the guy who came up with this line, Origen, a little bit later. Hopefully we'll at least mention him in passing. But Saints and Idiots comes from the phrase from Origen of Alexandria. He says, in the deep matters of God, there are only two groups of people who can have definite knowledge: saints and idiots. And the reason is, saints have definite knowledge because they know God and they understand God. Idiots because they think they know God and really don't know how little they know. So I always say I'm not in the former class. I hope I'm not in the latter class. One day maybe I'll be a saint. Hopefully I am never an idiot. But that's kind of the reason why we're doing Saints and Idiots. For me, it's a reminder that I don't know everything, even if sometimes I feel like I do. So, normally on a history of Christianity class, you would get at least 1 to 2 lectures on 586 BCE all the way up to Jesus, because it's good history and you need to know it, but we're going to dispense with it. We're also going to dispense with Jesus. It's it's the one time where you'll ever hear me say, we're going to dispense with Jesus. He's not as important for today. No. It's too hard to cram Jesus into this. There's some stuff in the notes. I should say I'm going to use CE and most of the time BCE, CE, and that's just because I studied this in an academic field. When you study it academically, you tend to use the academic lingo, which is CE instead of AD. It's no big deal one way or the other. Anyway, church history begins. Good, I'm only 5 minutes in. This is lovely. Church history begins really with the death of Jesus. And I kind of slipping into my more academic mode today. So with the claim that Jesus rose again and his apostles making that claim. This all happens right around 30-ish. Jesus was, of course, born sometime right around 6 BCE. We take that from the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Luke, mostly the Gospel of Matthew, saying that it was in the time of Herod the Great. There's a whole laundry list of Herods. You have them all in your notes. I forget exactly what page. Probably about page 2 or 3 in the notes. You'll get this laundry list of Herods. They were all named Herod. They're very confusing. I don't even think we have them all right, but Herod the Great dies in 4 BCE. Jesus is probably born sometime between 6 and 4 BCE. Dies somewhere around 30 CE when Pontius Pilate is governor. So we have that. Shortly after, we're not sure when, sometime in the next couple of years, probably not, you read the New Testament, you read the book of Acts, and you see Stephen stoned right away. There's probably a window of a year, 2 years, 3 years between those events. It would take some real time for the Jewish authorities to get so upset with this new group that they were calling them in and warning them and eventually stoning them. It's not going to happen overnight. There is just not that much resentment right away. There were several messiahs out there at the time, several groups proclaiming they had the Messiah. Usually what happened is you killed the Messiah and everybody scattered and went and found the next Messiah. Kind of like today where conspiracy theorists and cults, they gather around one individual and then you kill off the head and then they all scatter and they find their own little new leader and build up a following. You kill that guy and they all scatter. That's kind of what the Jews expected for the Christians. That's Gamaliel's famous speech. If this is of humanity, don't worry about it. It's going to go away. It's just going to dissolve. They expected that. They expected it to dissolve. So Stephen sometime is killed right then. Then we have the Council of Jerusalem is the next major event that we know anything about. Sometime between 45 and 50. So some 15 to 20 years after Jesus' death is the Council of Jerusalem, where they come together and they make this decision on who or how are Gentiles going to relate to Jews in the church. That's basically the decision. And that's all predicated on Peter's episodes in Antioch, Paul's episodes around Greece and what we call today Turkey, the Middle East, that little section, they called that was Asia. So those two events really triggered the need to figure out how are Gentiles going to relate. You can see that Paul writes the first, what I think is the first, there's a lot of scholarly debate on this. The first letter of Paul is 1 Thessalonians, I think so, 49 CE, roughly. Galatians wouldn't have been far behind that. 1 Corinthians wouldn't have been far behind that. But that's where we have the extant letters. There are some people out there who claim that the Gospels were written closer to the Council of Jerusalem, 45-ish. But those are very few scholars. Most scholars agree that the rest of the New Testament was written outside of Paul. Most of the New Testament was written sometime after 65. And most of it between 65 and probably 95. Actually, there are some scholars who would put 2 Peter as late as 110, but and this has a lot to do with authorship. What do we consider who do we consider an author? What does it mean to write a book? That's a whole nother lecture in and of itself. But the entirety of the New Testament is written between roughly 50 and 95. And you'll notice that the books are written differently. Paul is addressing letters to churches going through specific problems. Letters like really more 1 John than 2 John, but 1 John, 1 Peter, they're more generic letters meant to be circulated more widely circulated, that are not necessarily local to one group. These are probably letters written later. We have The gospel is written at the end of the first generation. So the first generation, you're going to see by the first generation, we've got all of this really is well Christianized. Rome and possibly out in here. And then the major cities down here are probably Christianized, have some Christian population. But at the same time, Christianity is still moving kind of slow. There's probably only 10 to 20,000 Christians. But as soon as I say that, I want you to see on the right-hand side, and you can't really see it, it's what's called a Sater square, S-A-T-E-R, Sater square. You can Google this. This was found in Pompeii, which Mount Vesuvius destroyed in 73 CE. There is evidence. This is scant evidence, but it is evidence that there was a Christian presence in Pompeii before it was destroyed, which is impressive because Pompeii was not a major city. It was a minor city, so the fact that Christians would have reached a minor city by that point is impressive. It shows some spread that we weren't necessarily aware of. And the Sater square is important because, and again, it gets cut off. I need a new projector. But the Sater square is important because when you rearrange the letters in this cube, and they all spell out the same words, but when you rearrange them, you get Pater Noster, which is our Father, with 2 leftover A's and 2 leftover O's, which Alpha and Omega in the Greek alphabet. So there is this thought process, because we found it on churches, that perhaps this is actually Christian graffiti and a way of writing our Father so that people wouldn't necessarily recognize it, because the words are just gibberish otherwise, or at least the sentence structure is gibberish. And this kind of symbolism was used by Christians fairly routinely. You've all seen the symbol of the Jesus fish. Well, in places, in cities, there would be half of that carved, or the whole thing sometimes, carved pointing a direction, and that would lead people to a church. Or if you were new to a city, you could find a place and scratch half of it into a wall or into the dirt or something like that. If you were new to a city, just scratch it in, and then if there was another Christian nearby, they would come by and complete it. And then you would know there are Christians. Christians use all kinds of symbols when they are outnumbered, when they are really in the minority. They use all kinds of symbols like this. My favorite, and it's not part of this lecture, but my favorite is the Japanese magic mirror, where they would make a mirror that when it reflected light, it would show a picture of Jesus on the cross. And so if you were traveling and you didn't know if somebody was a Christian, you could swing this mirror to catch the light, and it would reflect up on a surface Jesus on the cross, and then that person would know you're a Christian. Really cool. Maybe if we cover, what would that be, medieval 1500s Christianity, if we ever get that far, I will talk about it then, because it's awesome. But Christianity at this point is mainly an urban religion. The overwhelming majority of people lived in urban settings, and the overwhelming majority of people lived in very tight communities. Population density was a lot higher than it is now. Streets, I was saying this earlier, I've said this a couple times in a couple different settings. You know, we're in a room that's 50 feet wide, something like that, and that's nothing for a road. I mean, a road can be this wide pretty easily. A road in ancient Rome, I could touch both houses on either side. That was considered what we would consider a sidewalk today. was considered a road then. And houses built 60 feet in the air, 70 feet in the air, with tiny little one-room apartments all the way up. We're talking tens of thousands of people crammed into tiny tenements. These were really poor living conditions for the most part. But this is where the population had to go in order to find work, in order to find money. So they became population centers. Christians flourished in these urban environments, where in the rural environments it was just harder to find people. It was harder to go out into these rural communities. So Christians just generally did not do that. Okay. As they did, obviously, they've come from Jewish to Gentiles. Okay. Now, this is where I'm going to start. Oh, I got one more top. Okay. I don't think I put it in there. No, I didn't. The last thing I wanted to talk about before we really get into the second generation is this. In the first generation is, and I've got to look at my notes to find it. It is all the way back on page, there it is, 7 and 8 in the notes. Yeah. No, not 7 and 8. No. Yeah, I know. There it is. It starts on page 11 in the notes. And that is women in the early church. We don't think about it, but women play a huge role in the early church. We look at the book of Romans, and there are several women listed, including Lydia, who was the person who would have read the book of Romans to the congregation and probably preached the first sermons out of the book of Romans. She was actually a preacher. We look at Priscilla and Aquila. The fact that her name is listed first means she's probably the more important of the two. So when it talks about Priscilla and Aquila taught Apollos and were great missionaries, probably what it means is she was the more important of the two of them. Obviously, the women who come back from the tomb are trusted with the gospel first. Mark 16 gives us the first account of these women who are entrusted with the gospel. And then lastly, the last one I want to highlight quickly is Junia. Junia was an apostle, and that comes with a lot of baggage, because when Paul says that in Romans 16:9, that means that she is somebody who has all of the rights and privileges that he has. The rights to preach to the church, the right to write a letter and to expect it to be taken seriously. She has an authority within the church and governs. So Junia is an apostle, early apostle. There is a tiny little book. I think you can only get it as an ebook. Scott McKnight wrote it several years ago, called Junia is Not Alone. And it's a great little book that kind of captures why the church has forgotten Junia and why these early women actually matter. Now, that's kind of an important... Those are all important as we go into transitioning into the second generation. The major milestones of the second generation were really were transitioning about 64, 65 CE. Peter and Paul are both executed. Paul is beheaded. Peter is crucified upside down. And this really takes away the leadership. James, the brother of Jesus, had already been killed by the by a Jewish mob, thrown off of the temple, thrown off the top of the temple where he broke both his legs and then beaten to death. He had been the head of the church in Jerusalem. Peter and Paul had been the heads of the church in Rome and in really kind of what we would consider modern Greece and Turkey, respectively. These guys were major figures, and with their deaths, we start to transition away from that first generation into the second generation. And this becomes important. The first generation of Christians, doctrine was important, but what was more important was telling the story of Jesus. Yes, it was important that people got some things right about what they believed, but it was far more important to them that the person who was talking was telling the story of Jesus. So Peter and Paul were important not because they were possessors of great intelligence, not because they were people who had this doctrine all figured out. They probably would have been the first to tell you that they didn't. What was important and what made them true leaders was the fact that they had sat with Jesus. Paul, not necessarily sitting with Jesus, but there's this, we don't think about it, but he takes a decade, and kind of retreats and does nothing except for learn Jesus. He talks to Peter, he talks to James, he meditates, he prays, he listens to people, he listens to the stories. Peter obviously had been there. James, the brother of Jesus, even though the Gospels portray him as kind of unbelieving, there's every reason to believe that at some point before Jesus' death, he actually studied with Jesus and believed to some extent. I mean, it is very unlikely that Jesus' family was dead set against him all the way to the day of the cross. It's more likely that they had some internal conflict, that the gospel writers are intentionally they're intentionally kind of blowing up a little bit so that Jesus' family looks bad. And the reason is all of the disciples look bad in the Gospels. Every one of them looks bad. And it's meant to show us how we who initially don't do anything good can become like Peter or James or John or the other James or Paul. All of them look bad in the beginning and then end up being great in the end. And it's a storyline that we're supposed to follow. So we have Peter, James, Paul, they're all executed. Thomas, by this point, likely is in India, so he's out of the picture. And yes, he is likely in India. There are rumors that I think are fairly well-founded that when Franciscan monks went to India in the 1600s, they found Christians who trace their origins back to Thomas. So I do think that it's reasonable that he got all the way to India. We definitely know by the 800s, Christianity was all the way into China and India. Actually, by probably much earlier than that, but at least by the 800s, it was well into those two countries. I think that Thomas probably was there. So some of these early apostles had scattered and gone to the ends of the earth, quite literally. They just kept walking. Many of them had been killed. Many had been killed. And so we have this transition away from witness to doctrine. It becomes less about, did you see Jesus? Did you talk to Jesus? And it becomes much more about, what do you believe? And are we believing the right things about Jesus? And coincidentally, at the exact same time that the leadership of the church is changing over, we have this major event that we call the Jewish Revolt, where the Jews get really huffy about a lot of things. Some of it's legit, some of it isn't. Not going to bore you with too many details on that. But the Jews get really upset with Rome, and they start this major revolt. And there have been other revolts. There was a famous one in 6 AD, or CE. See, I tell you, I never know. In about 6, there was a famous revolt that was put down, but this was a major one. It was so major that Vespasian, who would become emperor, and Titus, his son, pretty much level Jerusalem. They just take it down. They take out the temple, which is, huge. That is a major deal for the Jews. Herod had built this temple up in the time of Jesus. He spent 40 to 50 years renovating this temple and making it into something that was truly majestic. But in 70, it's wiped out. It's gone. A group of rebels continue fighting the Roman legions and end in Masada with a mass suicide rather than being conquered. They slit their own throats. A group of men go around and kill everybody, men, women, and children, and then kill themselves. So it was a very brutal end. That event was very traumatic for the church as well. It's traumatic for all Jews, and the church still thought of themselves really as Jews at this point. Christians, while the name Christian might have been circulating, they still, if you ask them, there would be a strong tie to Judaism. Even though there were some fights, there were some sibling fights. We read about Claudius expelling all Christians from Rome, or all Jews from Rome, and that would include Christians. It probably wasn't all Jews, but a good number of Jews, because they had been fighting with Christians, infighting. So there was some battles, but they were still pretty much, there was still communication. There were still conversions happening. In fact, there were probably conversions happening both ways. There were Jews who were converting to Christianity, and there were Christians who were Gentile in origin going all the way over to Jewishness, just like today. But that event was seminal. And that event, most scholars believe that event helped shape the New Testament by the New Testament authors saying we need to begin to write down a lot of what Jesus said and did. There seems to be some references. They see all of this happening. They see Peter and Paul dying. They see the temple being destroyed. And they kind of go, well, we need to write this down. And so people like Mark, who was probably Peter's right hand at this point. By the time Peter is executed, Mark is probably Peter's right hand, writes down Peter's story. And then he goes off and becomes bishop of the city of Alexandria in Egypt, and starts circulating what we call Mark's gospel. Lot there, but again, that's another lecture. It's a whole different lecture. We get to the end of the first century, and there's just chaos, confusion, there's a shortage, there's famines, and mismanagement by the Roman government leads to greater famines. It's just it's a complete disaster in Domitian's reign at the end of the first century. And these events make things even more traumatic, and this is where we get the book of Revelation. Probably. Some scholars like David Awney will tell you that Revelation was composed over like 30 years, which there's no reason to doubt it. I just don't know that there's a reason to believe it either. But there's widespread shortages. A lot of people really thought the world was coming to an end. It was a really bad time. And so we do see Revelation and a couple other books springing up around this time. So this is kind of important. If you go back to, really it's the last page of the notes, it's page 13. You're going to see there a list of the Apocryphal Books of the New Testament. This is where we start to get some of these books, like the Didache, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Epistle of Barnabas. These are really good books. Those three that I listed are really good, and I would highly recommend people reading them. And what we're seeing reflected in them is this kind of, it leads us to recognize we don't know much about the first century church. There's a strong movement today to recapture the first century church. And it's by unintelligent people who have never actually looked into this. And I hate to condemn some people who I generally, I like, generally speaking, but they really don't know what they're talking about here. The first century church, we don't know what it looked like. We really don't. We don't know. The Didache gives us some examples of how to practice baptism. It gives us some examples of how to practice fasting. It gives us some examples of how to do some things in a church service, but it doesn't give us a lot. We, for instance, don't know how the church was structured. What was the hierarchy of the church? We have no idea. But the people who want to go back to the first century church will never tell you that. What they pick and choose a couple of passages from Acts that they really like, and they try to build an entire church around that, and it doesn't work. The Didache gives you multiple examples of how to do baptism. For instance, it says baptize in running water, and if that's not available, then pour water over the head. And if that's not available, you can baptize in sand. There's a lot of things that, a lot of emphases that I see that we don't necessarily know. There's a lot of things like, how do women fit into the early church? We don't know. I know that some people will point out Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 11, but those, actually, I should say there's some textual history that those might not be accurate. Those might be a scribal addition. And Paul earlier has said, if a woman prophesies, so if a woman is prophesying, how can she remain quiet? In other words, Paul's first example trumps his second by far. And even in Timothy, where a number of other people like to go, they disregard the context, they disregard the situation in Ephesus. And we really, when you get down to it, it actually looks more like Paul is not so much condemning women speaking in church or women pastors. It looks like Paul is more condemning a certain group of potentially factious people. But we disregard that when it comes to the first century church. We disregard a lot of things. And what we have to recognize is the church is an ever-evolving entity, at least in some ways. We carry on the traditional witness of Jesus. We carry on some of the traditional doctrines. But other than that, it changes to meet the circumstances and meet the context of the local environment. That's what we see in the first century. It was ever-changing, trying to meet the demands of the first century people. And we know that. We know that not every church was structured the same way. We don't know how they were structured, but there was not this uniformity the way that we might think of it. And so we have to have a good dose of humility. While we know a lot of things, there's a lot we don't know. And there's a lot we will never know, because Christians in the first century were still a very small minority of the population. They were still very much underrepresented as far as demographics. They would not have, their stuff's not going to survive. And they were being secretive. In the first century, we have reason to, at least we can kind of conclude this by some later stuff, but even this might not be completely accurate. We know that by the second century, at least, churches were structured in a way where if you were not a part of the church, you could attend the first half of the service, which was the collective meal and some of the singing and some of the praise. But then you were escorted out of the main room. They would do this, by the way, in a house. If there was a house big enough for about 20 to 30 people, they would have a house, one room, where they'd have a collective meal, and then they would escort people out who were not part of the church. And those people would either leave and go home or sit on the porch and be instructed, while the church service, the main body of the church service, was going on inside. Then, after those people had received their year to 2 years of instruction, they would be baptized on an Easter Sunday and be allowed to join the church. This had two purposes. Number one, it gave people plenty of one-on-one instruction without actually interrupting the flow of the service. You would be instructed on how the church operates. You would be instructed on the scriptures and the witness of Jesus. You would be instructed on a lot of things out one-on-one without having to go into the church and ask questions and disrupt the prayers and all of the other things that were happening. Number two, Christianity was not popular. You may or may not know that. Christianity was not popular at the time. And this prevented spies. Because the last thing we want in the church is spies. And so we come to the second century. And we get persecution. I'm going to start, and this is, I've said, I think I said this at the outset, I'm not going to follow these notes. I'm not going to do this chronologically. I'm going to do this more thematically. I think that you'll learn more in the short amount of time, plus it allows me to hit some of the high notes a few times. So we talk about persecution, but persecution is not generally what you think it is. Persecution starts, like I said earlier, when Claudius expels Christians from Rome. Well, really, persecution starts with Stephen and the stoning by the Jews. But that was never widespread. And really, it didn't last very long. We don't really have accounts of persistent Jewish persecution of Christians. Rather, it seems like once in a while, a mob got together and got really hostile and persecuted a few people. We see this in about 35 with the death of James, the death of Stephen, the imprisonment of Peter, and it causes a lot of Christians to scatter. But then we have years of sustained peace, followed by James, the brother of Jesus, being killed. And then we have sustained peace until the destruction of Jerusalem. So there's not widespread Jewish persecution. It probably is eventually there would be a charismatic leader arise, start really irritating a lot of Jews. They would get a mob together, they would kill that person, and then everything would subside. There's a lot of political tension that the Jewish people had. And we don't have time for that, so it's just suffice it to say there wasn't a lot of Jewish persecution of Christians. There also was not a lot of direct Roman persecution of Christians early on. Yes, Nero did kill Peter and Paul. Yes, Nero did blame the Christians for the Great Fire of Rome in 64, and he did impale Christians, cover them in wax, and light them on fire as torches for his garden parties. So I don't want to downplay that. That's kind of important.
But he was all right. He's a pretty good guy.
Well, no, he was a terrible guy. He is terrible. But the Romans as a whole didn't really come after Christians hard. It was sporadic. There was a Roman policy that said you were not allowed to have a secret society. We didn't talk about it at all, but leading up to Jesus in Rome, there was this outbreak right before, literally within 50 years of Jesus being born, there was this outbreak of what we call the mystery religions, like Mythos and the cult of Isis and the Sibyl. These are mystery cults, and the reason they're called mystery cults is because small groups of people will go into caves and other clandestine locations and have their meetings, and we don't know what happened. Nobody wrote them down. And those were technically made illegal in Rome because the Roman emperors at the time feared that these small clandestine organizations would become terrorists. Yeah. So there was a ban on private worship in small groups. It was technically on the books, even though it was very, very sporadically enforced. Like the cult of Mithras, it was never actually persecuted. Why? Because it was most popular among the army. And Roman emperors were not about to go in and persecute the army. They just weren't going to do it. But these kind of mystery cults was pro and con for the Christians. Con meant that they were automatically looked down on and made, and it was illegal. They were already despised by the Romans. Pro was the Romans were already predisposed to mystery religions that focused worship on one God and were ready for these kinds of rites and ceremonies. Made evangelism slightly easier. So we have this already in the works, and we have this law that says small groups, clandestine organizations must be persecuted. But the reality was that, with the exception of major events like the Fire of Rome, where Nero needed scapegoats, so he selected the Christians and rounded up as many as he could in Rome, killed them, persecutions were very sporadic. We have some letters from Pliny the Younger, whose father was killed in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, talking about persecuting Christians. So this is in the 70s and 80s. Domitian, at the end of the first century, started some localized persecutions. But we don't really have heavy, what we think of as rounding up and killing Christians until Diocletian in 294. Otherwise, we have sporadic stuff. And these are still horrific events. I'm going to draw your attention to, it's in the notes on the 2nd century, third century, sorry, it's 203, 204 BC, or CE. I think it's 204 CE. The Passion of Perpetua and Felicity. These are two women who, along with two of their compatriots, are killed in gladiatorial games. They are fed to the beasts. And this woman, Perpetua, who is 25 years old, well-educated, and seems to have been a leader in the church, writes this down. She writes down what happens to her, and it is saved by the church father Tertullian in Alexandria and preserved. She is martyred. Her father is drugged before the council, pleads for her to convert or to recant her faith. She refuses. They beat him. She still refuses. And so, despite the fact she is still nursing a child, is drugged off to die before the wild animals. We have a similar story of we have similar stories of bishops being drugged off, but these are really very sporadic events that don't terribly impact the growth the church. It's not like the church had to be for 400 years was cowering in fear lest the Roman emperors find them and kill them. That's kind of, I referenced Japan earlier, that is kind of what happened in Japan, and you see that the Japanese church to this day has remained very, very small. And the traditional Catholic Church from the 1600s was almost exterminated in a matter of 400 years. So when we have similar circumstance, that's how we normally think of Rome, but that's not what it was. It was more of this. This is more the persecution that the Christians faced. Every aspect of Roman life was governed by religion. Your job, if you were a tradesman in the day, if you were a stonecutter, or you had a certain job, you had, just like today, a union hall where you all gathered and you ate together and you talked business. The difference is that union hall would have been a temple. It would have been a temple to Zeus or Dionysus or one of the other pantheon. And you would have been expected to go to that temple and perform rituals in that temple as part of your job. If you were a tradesperson, if you were trading, there were elements of trade that were conducted in temples. This is Paul's letter to the Corinthians about going to the temples to eat. It's not like somebody's just going to the temple the way we would go to Steak and Shake. They're not just going for the food. They're not just going because their friends are going to be there. This is actually part of their livelihood. So not being able to interact in the temple in the right way would cause serious repercussions. There's a book on the back page that I highly, highly recommend. I think that he does a really good job, and that's Longenecker's The Lost Letters of Pergamum. He does a really good job. It's fictionalized. It's a fictionalized account. I'm not going to say too much more of that, but it's letters written as a fictionalized account, but it really gets behind the culture of the day. I love that one. It kind of highlights some of this stuff. And it highlights the persecution. It highlights how the persecutions really happened and what went on, and how, the real fears of being denounced as a Christian, and how that worked in the world. I also recommend there's this whole series. I put the one, A Week in the Life of a Slave. My professor, John Byron, wrote that one. But there's this whole series of A Week in the Life. I think it's IVP Press who puts it out. A Week in the Life of I think it's a Greco-Roman woman. A Week in the Life of Corinth. A Week in the Life of Ephesus. This whole series. It's really good. I haven't read most of the series, but it's really good and comes highly recommended. These kinds of books get into that first century culture, and I recommend them because they show you what life was like in a fictional way, written by legitimately good New Testament scholars. But both those series are legitimate. John Byron, who wrote A Week in the Life of a Slave, his doctoral dissertation from Durham is actually on first century Roman slavery. So if there's anybody who's going to know how a first century Roman slave lived, it's John Byron. And so he's writing this fictionalized account, and it's good fiction, and it's really good because he knows what he's talking about. But that is kind of persecution. Oh, that's right. This is persecution in the first century. This is what you'd have to expect. So the scribbling here, Alexandrius celebete, this is celebrates Deus, God. Alexander celebrates his God, or Alexander worships his God. This is the kind of persecution that you could expect in the first century. Alexander was probably a slave. This was probably written by one of his fellow slaves to really abuse him. He was probably very much abused within the household by the non-Christians. But you can see that the depiction is of a man being crucified with a donkey's head. This was graffiti left on a house. So, but it gives you an idea of what it would have been like for Christians in the first century. Fairly, probably a lot of having to bite your tongue and hold back some rage. Probably a lot of major inconveniences in life. I don't want to use minor inconveniences because that's more major inconveniences than what we see, but not out and out, we're coming for you like we might see in Afghanistan right now. More like some African nations where Christians are tolerated, but barely. Or maybe like some avenues of China where Christians are barely tolerated, not really. But that's kind of how persecution worked in the first century. Oh my goodness. Time is getting away from me. I haven't even gotten... Okay. Oh, that cut that off. So spirituality is the next topic that I really want to talk about. That's kind of persecution from all the way from the first century all the way to the end. Again, the great persecution of 294. Diocletian is legitimately rounding up Christians, especially bishops and government officials, high-ranking people. He's rounding them up. He's killing them, and he's telling them, you have to hand over all of your scriptures. So there's a real purge of any Christian documents and leadership, especially leadership within the church, bishops and government officials who might be Christians. That did happen, but that's a little later in the story. Spirituality is another big key. So we don't know much about first century worship. We know that Eucharist, communion, was a major theme. We know baptism was a major theme. Those two things were extremely important. We know that they sang hymns. We know that prayer was important. Other than that, we don't know much. But beginning in, and fasting. Fasting was vitally important, 2 days a week. Beginning with the end of the first century, we see writings that start to talk more and more about spirituality, what we would consider spirituality, talking about prayer, mystical visions, prophecy. This sort of stuff becomes more important. We see especially a rise start around the 3rd century, around the year 200, with people like Abba Anthony, Saint Anthony the Great, who's up there. We see people going to the desert. We see people isolating themselves for prayer, fasting. We're going to talk about John Chrysostom off and on. John Chrysostom was a famous patriarch or bishop of Constantinople, and he was first a famous mystic who tried. He went to a cave and lived in a cave for 2 years, where he tried to wean himself off of food and sleep, to really devastating impact on his body. This became important. Celibacy became vitally important during this time because it was a way of denying the flesh. The early impetus of this was to model after Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness. If Jesus is going to do it 40 days, I'm going to make it a lifestyle. Famously, Simon Stylitos, or Simon of the Tower, climbed up on a 30-foot pillar. I have no idea how big around it was, but he climbed up on top of a 30-foot pillar with a rope that he would lower down a basket for food and lower down his chamber pot when it was full, and people would raise up food to him, and he lived up there for years and years and years. Sketis, or Skeet, is in the Egyptian desert, and this became a community of like-minded people. Men and women had communities together that would grow and learn together. I pulled some books off my shelf that I thought people might find interesting. They're over here. One of those I think that I pulled, and I think it's on the middle table, is The Sayings of the Desert Fathers, which is all of these guys from Skeet in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries. Really good book. And it's just little pithy sayings that the more you think about them, the deeper they become. Like, go to your room and it will teach you everything you need to know. Okay. And you have to think about it and ponder it. And they were known for fasting. St. Anthony famously only ate, and the man lived to be over 100. He famously only ate one meal every other day. He was a tough old bird, and he'd live plating reeds into mats and baskets to sell. And they would take these to market and sell them, and that's what they would use to buy their food, and that's how they lived. It really speaks volumes to me that these guys lived in the desert and plaited reeds and were very isolated, only spending hours a day in prayer and only talking sporadically. It especially speaks volumes to me as I have 4 screens open right now and a camera trained on me. I have 2 computer screens, a tablet, and a phone all active at this second, and I'm talking about guys who went out into the desert so that they didn't have to talk to people. But then they would say things like, even out in the desert, temptation is still there. And it was not just men. Women did this too. The collection that I have of the Desert Fathers, I believe, is only the Desert Fathers. But I put a different book in the notes here under the further reading section that actually is the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers. So I do recommend that one. You'll get people like Saint Mary and some others who I'm not as familiar with. I know Mary. I don't know if Macarnia is in there or not. I don't know the whole list, but they become popular. We see people like Ephraim the Syrian becoming popular. Ephraim is a famous hymn writer, and so I'm going to give you at least, this is part of Ephraim's Nativity hymn number 7. Son of the Maker is like unto his Father as Maker. He made himself pure body. He clothed himself with it, and came forth and clothed our weakness in glory, which in his mercy he bought from the Father. From Melchizedek the high priest, a hyssop came to thee, a throne and crown from the house of David, a race and family from Abraham. Be thou unto me a haven, and for thine own sake, O great sea, lo, the psalms of David, thy father, and the words also of the prophets come forth unto me. as it were ships. That's just a little. It's really good, deep theology that Ephraim tried to popularize in his songs, and these became very widespread. We see others begin to start writing collections of prayers. We see John Chrysostom he will be in the 4th century. He writes liturgies for the church. We begin to see some of as it goes by, we begin to see this kind of development of a purely spiritual side of the church. And it gets a little divorced from some of the rest of the church. This is one of the elements that I kind of want you to see, is we're going to start to see that there are some in the river. If you picture the river of Christianity, or if you picture all of Christianity as a river, you're going to start to see that there are channels in the river. There are currents in the river. And this current of spirituality becomes one, and let's put it all the way off to the extreme left. It becomes a current, and it kind of gets isolated, and little bits of it get broken off from the river of Christianity over here. Like Montanus, who said that who believed that he was a prophet. And he walked around in the 150s saying that he was a prophet, and that God revealed all of Scripture through him, and that any written Scripture could be disavowed. He and 2 women walked around, and they were very charismatic leaders who were ultimately condemned because they didn't believe in the Scripture. That's where that current of spirituality took some people out of the main body of the river and pushed them off to the side because they didn't want to stay connected. They just wanted to be in that little current. This is what we're going to see kind of become the nature of Christianity. The idea that these branches, as Christianity moves more and more away from the foundation of witnessing Jesus, it becomes easier and easier to spread out to the wide sections of the river and get caught up in things like pure spirituality, which eventually pushes people off to the side. We'll talk about them later. Yeah. But those kinds of groups, they move away. But yet we have these people who stay in the stream. People like Ephraim, who writes hymns. People like St. Anthony and so many other great ascetics who live out what it means to be Christian, trying to pray and understand God deeper. And then that brings us to St. Augustine, who we're going to talk about probably again and again, who wrote the first spiritual autobiography, a book called Confessions. If you've never read Augustine's Confessions, you need to read it. It is wonderful. It is life-changing. But it is the story of how he found God. And it's part deep theology and part personal encounter. Like very charismatic personal encounter. So I highly recommend that. Major heresies. Good. Okay. Somehow I was thinking when I put the slides together that I would go straight from spirituality to heresies, because this is what happens in the church. We get focused in on one thing and we start to get these heresies. So we get things like Gnosticism start creeping in. As we start to move away from the first century leaders are witnesses to Jesus, and the witness to Jesus is the most important thing, and start to move towards doctrine being the most important thing, we get things like Gnosticism. Gnosticism says that the God of the Old Testament was an evil God who trapped the spirits, or trapped our spirits, in a physical world, and that all physical matter is evil. It is the pagan side of asceticism. People like St. Anthony wanted to control the flesh and bind it and really limit how much the flesh impacted their daily life. So they went out and they fasted and they prayed and they remained celibate so that they would conquer the flesh. These people just went whole hog and said, the flesh is bad, it's evil, and it must be destroyed. And so Jesus came to destroy our flesh, which isn't true. It goes against Christianity, and so Christians were left to talk about it. We've talked a little bit, yeah. Oh man, keeps cutting this stuff. I think all of these are listed. I'm pretty sure all of these are listed in the notes. So they're just listed chronologically. But we have beliefs that Jesus only appeared to die on the cross, that he was truly God and never really human, only appeared to be human, and so he never really died. And we have Arianism, which says that Jesus was completely begotten by God and never had, is not co-eternal. He's just a lesser being. He's a being lesser than God and greater than us. These were all condemned as heresies because they don't give adequate place to Jesus. The wonderful thing is that we still have some respect for Jesus in this time. But you can see where these heresies start creeping up as it becomes more and more about doctrine and what we believe. We have to confront all of this. So these become major heresies. In response, we start to see some of the major figures of the church. And you'll notice, they all come from Africa, or many of them, early on. So we have Alexandria down here. You see Jerusalem's here, Antioch, Alexandria, Carthage, and then Hippo is over here. And those become the major cities. Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria, Carthage, and Hippo. Well, Hippo not until Augustine later in the 5th century. But major cities, Alexandria, Antioch, those are the two primary cities of the church. And the church starts to move south and really into Alexandria. Now, this is important. A couple reasons. Number one, it shows us Tom Oden, who is on the further readings thing, has suggested that we need to, as a church, as a global church, really invest in the fact that Christianity owes major debts to the African continent. In a day and age where there's some tension over race relations, we need to acknowledge our debt to Africa. But there's a second, and that is true. I mean, all of those cities, all three, Carthage, Hippo, Carthage, and Alexandria, all produced major, I mean seminal people. And especially at the time between the 1st and the 2nd century. First century on. There were just a lot of big names. Tertullian, Origen, Cyprian, Augustine. These people are major people in the church. We can't really speak of the church without speaking of the Alexandrian school. So, number one, we do have to acknowledge our debt to Africa. Number two, the reason why we talk about Alexandria quite a lot is after the Jews after Jerusalem was destroyed in 586 BCE by Nebuchadnezzar, many Jews escaped and went to Egypt. And the city that most of them located themselves in was Alexandria. This became a metropolis, a thriving metropolis for Jewish, just Jewish civilization. They have their own kind of ideals. This is where the Greek Bible, the Bible was originally translated into Greek, the Hebrew Bible. We call it the Septuagint. The Septuagint is what every Christian is using at this point in the story. Up until Jerome in the late 300s. Up until Jerome in the late 300s, every Christian is using the Septuagint as their Old Testament. Alexandria is where that happened. Philo of Alexandria, who's sitting on that first table over there, was the major Jewish thinker. He was a major Jewish philosopher who truly impacted Christian philosophy in some ways. Major Jewish philosopher. If we were talking Jewish philosophy, we'd have to talk Philo for a long time. But beyond that, beyond just being a Jewish center, Alexandria became a center of learning. You might have all heard of the famous Alexandrian library that burned down. It was a major loss to the ancient world. Well, that's because Alexandria rivaled places like Athens as a major center for schooling and philosophy. So while we have that spirituality trek on this side, over here on the left, on the right-hand side, we're going to get this philosophical trek, this philosophical current in the river. And it's those people. Those guys, Clement, Alexander, well, not so much Clement. I will say Clement was more of a spiritual writer, but especially starting with Tertullian, we get these very philosophical, highly intellectual arguments about God. Justin Martyr is another one of the early ones. We start to see this idea that pagans are giving intellectual cases against Christianity, and so we start to have what are called apologies, which apology in English means I'm sorry. Apology in Latin means defense. So these are written defenses to confront claims made about Christianity. On the back, towards the end of the notes, I have some major claims made by Jews and there they are. Roman claims, page number 10. Roman claims against Christianity and the refutations. These claims were actually legitimate Roman claims, like Christians are cannibals. They eat the blood of infants. That is something that Justin Martyr, I believe it's in his first apology. It might be in his second, but I think it's his first apology. He confronts that and says, of course we're not cannibals. That's disgusting. Don't you see what we do for babies? Which we'll get to that too. But these people, this is the rise of Christian intellectualism. People like Justin are the first to really respond to Roman claims. Part of Origen's career was made on his book against Celsus. Celsus, we don't know anything about Celsus other than what Origen quotes from him. But he was a pagan philosopher who made these claims against Christianity, and Origen's entire book against Celsus is simply his refutation of the claims that Celsus makes. Marcus Aurelius makes claims against Christians. Other philosophers of the times we start to see this growth of Christian defense, which is going to come in as the heresies become more and more prevalent. So Gnosticism. Christians start writing doctrines against Gnosticism. They start writing against Montanism. They start writing against Docetism and all these other isms, beginning at about 100 and going all the way through this period. And they start to get more and more hard line on some issues. And you notice what that's doing is tapering Christianity. So as these Christians begin to react against the different schisms and the different philosophies that are out there, they're actually unintentionally drawing lines around Christianity. Because it's just like the Supreme Court. What one church father says, another church father is going to repeat. And eventually, if enough church fathers say it, that's kind of more or less how we look at things, for right and wrong. Now, I say that, and then I notice that two of those individuals, Tertullian and Origen, that are up there, are both have what we consider heretical beliefs. I consider them church fathers, but it's only recently they've really been considered church fathers because they have some beliefs that are outside. We consider them outside of the body of Christ. For me, that shows that you don't have to have everything. You don't have to have, you don't have to have everything right. You can just have, you can just, exist. You can have some things wrong about God, because those guys were great thinkers. They were great Christians, and they should be well respected. And they had some things wrong. Again, as Origen said, the only people who truly know everything, or the only people who truly speak with confidence about the divine matters, are saints and idiots. He didn't consider himself a saint, but he wasn't an idiot. So he's going to get some things wrong. So we see that they're starting to unintentionally draw hard lines. We're also going to see that they're unintentionally drawing hard lines around Scripture. Okay. They're unintentionally drawing hard lines around Scripture. There is no church council that just says these are the 27 books of the New Testament. The first church father to actually say these are the 27 books of the New Testament is Athanasius of Alexandria, who lived in the 4th century. And just because he was the first doesn't mean he was the definitive source. There was hot debate over what books were in and what books were out. And to this day, there is not universal agreement about what books are in and what books are out. We think there are. We think there's universal because every Bible we see is printed the same way. Unless you happen to own a Catholic Bible, and then you think, well, there's some stuff in the Old Testament and there's some disagreements there. But there are also some churches that consider the Epistle of Barnabas to be legit. It was written in the 2nd century, but they include it. Or the Shepherd of Hermas. Or the Didache. All three books I do think you ought to read if you get a chance. They're good, solid books. The Shepherd of Hermas is a little wild and out there. If you like Revelation, you'll like the Shepherd of Hermas. If you don't like Revelation, steer clear of the Shepherd of Hermas. There were many bishops who said Revelation, Jude, and 2 Peter are out. There were. Many bishops did not want to include. There was hot debate over whether or not 2 Peter was actually written by Peter, and so many bishops did not want to include it. Many churches at the time did not include it. The same is true of Jude, and the same is true of Revelation, although it's less true of Jude. 2 Peter and Revelation were the last two books to really be included in what we call the canon. The canon, by the way, just means the rule of faith. It is a guideline. It's like a measuring stick. It's like, I forget where it's at, but somewhere in the world there is the inch. It is actually a physical square tile that is 1 square inch. It is the measure by which all other measures are measured. That is the Bible. How do I know that C.S. Lewis speaks Christian and speaks from God? Because he speaks in line with the Bible. So because C.S. Lewis speaks in a way that is in line with the Bible, I can accept that C.S. Lewis was anointed by God in some way. Maybe not the same way as Mark the Apostle, but in some way. So when we talk about Christian books, we talk about them as ordained and anointed by God to the extent that they measure up to the rule of Scripture. That's what that means. So let's talk Constantine, because I wanted to give you plenty of time to ask questions, and it doesn't look like I'm going to. Constantine the Great. So I mentioned way early that in 294, Diocletian started the Great Persecution. Diocletian was oh my goodness, he was a genius. He saw the map of Rome, and he said, this is too big for one man. Let's divide it. And so he divided it in half, east and west. Actually, let's do this. Okay, so Diocletian divides it right there, about right like that. And that becomes Byzantine, Roman. So there's this east-west. There's always been this east-west cultural difference. The West typically is more Latinized. The East is more Greek, more Hellenistic, we say. There's also a division in the church that kind of runs kind of here, like that. In some ways, it's kind of a north-south divide. The way that people think in the north is not the way that people think in the south. And so Diocletian divides the empire east and west, and he appoints 3 more emperors. He appoints himself what he calls Augustus of the east, and he makes a man named Maximus Augustus of the west. They each have a junior officer who is the Caesar. In 305, Diocletian decides to resign. Now, he had set up a system that automatically meant because he decided to resign, Maximus had to give up his throne. There could never be an emperor, a true Augustus, who came to power and held more control than the other emperor. So that when one died or resigned, both of them were gone. So Maximus had to resign. The trouble was, a man named Constans was Maximus's Caesar. He was his second. And he was living, I think he was in Gaul at the time, and he died before he could assume power, which meant that there was no Caesar and no Augustus in the west, and the Augustus of the east was resigning. So there was a power vacuum. And Maximus said, well, since my Caesar died, I'm just going to come back and I'm not going to resign. Well, that caused a lot of tension. And Constance's son, Constantine, who was in Britain at the time, well, he didn't like that, and neither did the army that he controlled. And so Constantine marches to Rome with the blessing of the army. Yeah, I know. And in 312, he's crossing Italy, and he's outside. It's actually, I think it's October of 312. He's right outside of Rome. And he has a vision. And he has a vision of a Christian symbol. As he's at night, in the vision it says, "In this symbol go and conquer." And he gets up and he asks his juniors, "Does anybody know what this symbol is?" And they say it's a Christian symbol. And he goes out and he adorns all of the shields in his legion with the Chi Rho, which is if you go into the sanctuary up on the altar, there's a cloth, and it has the chi rho in the middle. It looks like an X with a P in the middle. The X is the chi. What looks like a P is a rho. They're Greek letters. They're the first two letters of the word Christos, or Christ. And so Constantine has those emblazoned on shields, and they march on Rome in the name of the Christian God. Now, by this time, despite the great persecution of Diocletian, which has just ended, Christians probably make up a significant minority in the Roman Empire. We're talking 30 to 40% of the empire, maybe more. They were a significant minority. And in places like Rome, there is every chance that they were a majority. Again, we are talking about one major city. This would be like saying in the United States, Muslims today make up a significant minority, and if you go to one city like Dearborn, they're a majority. It's not to say that Christians overwhelmed by any numbers. You could still go large places. You can go to large portions of the empire and not meet Christians. But in Rome, there was a significant church, and it had deep roots. And again, Diocletian, who is persecuting the church, is in the eastern half of the empire, so his persecutions are not really hitting the West as hard as they were the East. In the East, they were losing bishops. Alexandria was losing a lot of bishops, a lot of high-ranking people. A lot of people were recanting. Rome was relatively stable as far as the church goes. Here comes Constantine. He conquers Maximus, kills him, becomes sole emperor. Because Diocletian, doesn't really outright become sole emperor, but he's the only one with real power right now. There's a few armies. It's going to take him a few years. It takes him until about 320-ish, which is about 7 years to really solidify power. But he's the major player at this point. He's living in Milan, and in February of 313, he issues what we call the Edict of Milan. And the Edict of Milan says that Christianity is henceforth a legal religion within the Roman Empire. Not the religion of the Roman Empire, a legal religion within the Roman Empire. He gives tax breaks to the clergy and to the church. He helps the church. He finances the church. He builds churches. And as he consolidates power, the church becomes more and more prolific. With the exception of Julian the Apostate, who rises to power shortly, very briefly in the 330s after Constantine's death, there is not another truly pagan emperor of Rome. And I say truly pagan in the sense that there's not another emperor who doesn't at least claim Christianity in the way that presidents of the United States at least claim Christianity, whether or not they actually serve Christians. So this is a fundamental change. We see the... Oh, wait, let's put that up there. That's just as important. 380, when the Emperor Theodosius makes Christianity the official religion. That's actually more important in some ways than 313, because at that mark, with the Edict of Thessalonica, the church has power. You cannot serve in the Roman army unless you're a Christian at that point. You cannot be a government official unless you are a Christian at that point. It becomes the religion of the empire. So those two dates are both vitally important, and in some ways the second one is more important than the first one, even though by 380 Rome is pretty well defunct. So in the West, at least, you're not going to have, it's not going to really matter quite so much. That edict really sets up what we call Byzantium and the Byzantine Empire, which is basically the eastern half of the Roman Empire. And it will last for another almost 1,000 years that the Byzantine Empire remains in power. But now we have the age of the bishops. And this is important. So you see all of the bishops, major Eastern bishops, major Western bishops. Except for Jerome, who was not a bishop, but I had to put him up there because he's one of the 8 great church doctors. Doctor means teacher. The great doctors of the East are Athanasius, Chrysostom, Nazarensis, and Basil. The great doctors of the West are Ambrose, Jerome, Augustine, and Gregory the Great, who doesn't figure into this discussion at all. He comes a little later. But those are the 8 great teachers of the church. Notice they're all, except for one, in this time frame. After the church gains legitimacy, and part of the reason is because the church has gained legitimacy, the writings of these people have been preserved. Also, the writings of these people were able to circulate more. The church gained some official status, and so their volumes, their libraries were collected. I think that before Augustine, the largest Christian library that we have might be Tertullian. I think that's right. And I think that Tertullian it's like 2,700 pages. By comparison, and don't quote me on, I think it's Tertullian, and I think it's 2,700 pages. By comparison, Augustine's City of God, which is one book, in the Penguin edition is like 1,100 or 1,200 pages. And that's just one of his books. He dwarfs everybody else, except for people like Chrysostom. Chrysostom's widely known. So there's the church being united with Constantine has this pro of now we can freely read the church, where 20 years before the Edict of Milan, all church documents were being burned. Now they're widely distributed and made available. Jerome and Augustine famously had debates. Jerome lived in Bethlehem in a cave as he's translating the Vulgate, and Augustine lived in Hippo on the other side of the empire. And they debated each other via letter that were circulated. That would never have happened 20 years before that. They were debating 50, 100 years earlier, they wouldn't have been able to do that. So we have some benefits, some downsides of the change in Constantine was Constantine really became church authority. He was allowed to govern church affairs. One of the first things that happened after Constantine assumes power is the people of Alexandria, again, there's that name, write to him asking him to convene a council to deal with the Arians. And here are the 4 great church councils, or the first 4 of the great church councils. They're all in the notes, but the Council of Nicaea, called to deal with the Arian controversy. Was Jesus equal with God or not? Famously, Athanasius famously battled Arius in this, and Athanasius is a young man. He's still not even Bishop of Alexandria yet. Alexander is Bishop of Alexandria. sent Athanasius, and Athanasius is the one who takes the lead in battling Arius head to head on this subject, and wins the day. Famously, Santa Claus punches Arius. Actually, it's more of St. Nicholas, the great St. Nicholas, stands up in the middle of the council. There's probably like 300 bishops there, and slaps Arius across the face for preaching heresy. St. Nicholas was known for his compassion and his generosity, and he smacks Arius, which is just, I mean, it may not have happened, but I like to think it did. But this opens the door for the Roman government, and essentially every government since then, to have control over church affairs. Every government in the West, including our own, derives some authority from that event at the Council of Nicaea. Because every European government derives some authority from the Roman Empire. All of their kings take some cues from Rome, and this tradition within the church of aligning to the state in some ways takes its tradition from Nicaea, and this now we have, this is the kind of negative convalescence of church and state. We also have, in the negative side, these two died. Well, no, I think Athanasius, both of them were exiled by emperors. Both Athanasius and John Chrysostom, two of the greatest preachers in the history of the church, were exiled. Athanasius several times. Why? Because the balance of political power between the what we call Orthodox and the Arian Christians kept bouncing back and forth. Even though Arius was excommunicated, one of his disciples, Eusebius of Nicomedia, was a major player in Constantine's court. In fact, he actually baptizes Constantine on Constantine's deathbed. Arians gained political power. Well, it meant Athanasius, who was the biggest opponent to Arius, was exiled. John Chrysostom was exiled because he was in the capital of Constantinople, and, well, he compared the empress to Jezebel because she was extremely greedy and had a ton of clothes and liked to show off how much she had. And so he said that in a sermon, and he was therefore exiled and died on his way to exile. So we have this, now the church has to appease the state. We have to now watch what we say because of political games. This is one of the drawbacks to Constantine. Before Constantine, preachers pretty much just said whatever they felt like about the emperor, and the church kind of went, yeah, you're right. After Constantine, preachers had to be a little more careful. Also after Constantine, the church got subsidies for helping the poor. Before Constantine, there was no real charity. Charity did exist, but not like the Christians. The Christians made their name on charity. They made their name on charity. It was things like giving to the poor. The bishopric of Alexandria in the 200s supported something like 1,500 widows. Now, I mean, Alexandria was a big-time city, but 1,500 is a lot. The church was known for ending abortion, and they did it by picking up exposed babies and teaching their members that it was wrong to have an abortion. And that's all they did. That was all they did. There's a great book, again, it's on the back, Abortion and the Early Church by Michael Gorman. I highly recommend that one. It was phenomenal. But they considered abortion wrong. They considered service in the army wrong. They considered the gladiatorial games wrong, all because they ended life, and life was sacred. With the transition with Constantine, with that transition of power, the church no longer had that authority to really speak on some of those issues, because Constantine was Christian, and so service in the military changed. Even though Constantine's political ends did not really always align with the church, there's a lot of debate about how much Christianity influenced the Roman Empire. It doesn't seem like Christianity influenced the Roman Empire very much. In fact, the historian Peter Heather, I do recommend his book on the fall of Rome. It's really good. Very dry, and it'll take you a long time to read, but very good. He talks about the fact that Christianity does not seem to have changed the Roman Empire that much. The politics of the day remained the politics of the day. And the greater question, which has not been researched as much, is how much did the Roman Empire actually change Christianity? And there actually does look like there's more of a reason to believe that Christianity suffered more from Constantine's transition than the Roman Empire actually changed. It looks like bishops were a little less free. The church became a little more stagnant in some ways. There was a lot less concern with issues that had been concern. People became Christians out of political motivations rather than convictions. And so church offices became a little more political. John Chrysostom famously was a terrible host to the politicians that he had to play host to, even though he was the bishop, so he had to play host. Follow the Roman Empire. He had to play host to all these people, and he was just a terrible host. But that was part of his job now as Bishop of Constantinople, which was the imperial city. We see that Christianity again starts to, I talk about channels within the great river of Christianity. We start to see some channels developing. We start to see a channel of state church developing, where it's Christian state liturgy. And that channel starts to progress, and it becomes kind of the hierarchy of the medieval Catholic Church, which even today, the Pope wears the robes of a Roman politician. That's the exact same way that, I forget which Roman office that represents. I think it's a legate, but it actually literally is supposed to look like a Roman robe. We have a hierarchy, or a kind of a stream of this Christian intellectualism, this bishops. You notice that the great doctors of the church all come from this time frame, the great teachers. I have several books over here by some of them. They become, that Christian intellectual stream really takes off. And then a third stream that really starts to take off is this blend of, it's what I would call practical Christianity. This is what people actually believed in their day-to-day lives. I didn't put this one on there, but Ramsay McMullen has a great book on this, Christianity and Paganism in the 4th through 8th centuries. That one's a little more technical, but he gets on how Christianity just starts to blend Roman paganism and Christian ideas, and it's kind of this overlay. We had all these Roman pagan ideas of a pantheon of gods. We'll just overlay the cult of the saints on top of that, And so these beliefs evolve and don't really go away. And we see that all the time where our ancestors' beliefs that are outside of Christianity, we just kind of tend to overlay Christianity on top of them, and it doesn't really change their belief structure. It just kind of slowly evolves away. And as the roots of that shrivel up and die, those beliefs will tend to die. Even like today, the cult of the saints means something completely different than what it did back in, say, 500, when it was really beginning. So it evolves, and the church can kind of rope it in, but that stream of practical Christianity starts to really take off. And you will notice, if you traced it, if we had more time, I would do some of this. Each of those streams, state church, intellectual church, we also still have that spirituality church and that common person, I like the word vulgate, it just means common. Vulgar church, all have they have this core Christianity that's right, and then you'll see little trickles that go off and little streams that kind of break away and try to form their own traditions and eventually dry up. But what we're starting to see is things like Vincent of Lorraine, who says that what Christianity is the things that have been believed always, everywhere, by all people at all times and in all places. Which, again, you're starting to see Christianity defined more by doctrine than by witness. You're seeing that theme. It's not the witness of Jesus in all times and in all places by all people. It's the doctrines. Christianity is just beginning to develop into what do we believe, which is in some ways the wrong way to look at it. And the fall of Rome, nobody really has a great date on when Rome falls, but these are the dates that matter. Rome just kind of fades into nothingness on the western side, and petty kings take over, and the church becomes the institution. In the East, Christianity and the Roman Empire thrive. They call themselves Byzantium, and it really thrives. I also didn't talk about it because it's just hard to fit into all of this. There is a major church that extends from Syria in the Middle East all the way to China and down to India. It's called Nestorian Christianity. It's the Syrian Orthodox Church. This is one of those great still puzzles. Philip Jenkins has more on this in his book, The History of Lost Christianities. Great book. But it's really kind of, we don't have a lot because not a lot of the sources survived after the Muslim invasion in the 800s. But right about this time is when that church is really starting to take off. About the time that Rome falls, Jerusalem really is the center of the Christian world. So on our maps, on most maps you'll see Jerusalem's on the far east because it shows Christianity on the far west, all the way to Spain. But the reality is about 400 to 500, Jerusalem's the center point of the world. It extends as far to the east as it does to the west. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I wanted to leave a lot more time for questions. But if anybody has questions, I'd love to hear them. So, anything?
Can you talk a little bit about
Ambrose of Milan. Ooh, yeah, I can. Okay, so Ambrose of Milan was. We'll get back here. Time. Don't have time. Come on. There we go. Okay, Ambrose of Milan, his dates are up there. Ambrose was a just outstanding figure. He was a very successful lawyer and mayor of the city of Milan. Extremely successful, incredibly intelligent individual. and the Bishop of Milan dies. A mob literally goes to his door in the governor's palace or whatever, the residence there, picks him up, carries him to the cathedral, and sits him on the chair of the bishop and installs him as bishop. He then goes on to write a series of he's an outstanding thinker. He writes a lot on church controversies and against heresies. There is some confusion because Ambrose was credited with some commentaries that are equally genius, but are definitely not him. We now call that person Ambrositor. He's also in your notes, but he does not. We don't know who it is. His writings got confused with Ambrose and was given credit. But Ambrose is this great writer who really takes the lead in some critical controversies. But he's best known for his tutelage of Augustine. Augustine comes to Milan in his young days as he's really searching. Augustine was a very troubled soul, but a great thinker. And he comes to Milan and he sits under Ambrose for a number of months, and I think actually years, learning from Ambrose. And eventually that is part of what sparks Augustine's conversion. So yeah, he's a tremendous thinker.
The Gnostics.
Yeah.
All right. So in my teaching that I've been taught, the Gnostics were about trying to get a supreme being.
Yeah.
And in your definition, it doesn't talk about any supreme being at all.
Yeah, and there's so the Gnostics that's kind of an umbrella term for a lot of different groups who had some different theologies. Typically, and I didn't use supreme being in the notes, but yeah, there's this overarching deity who they don't really talk about much, and then the God of the Old Testament who creates everything in the world, but he's really an evil God, and this overarching God sends Jesus kind of as an end around to undermine this to undermine this Yahweh figure of the Old Testament and release all of the spirits from the captivity of the body that this Yahweh has devised for us. And we know he's evil because he commands all kinds of violence and bloodshed in the Old Testament. And so he has to be evil. And yeah, let's.
So if I wrote a paper or wrote something about saying it's a supreme being, I would be wrong.
No, supreme being. There is a supreme being. He's just not factored in much. It's usually a contest between Jesus and the God of the Old Testament.
Okay.
Yeah, at least from what I've read. Again, the Dead Sea Scroll, or not the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nag Hammadi Library is over on that first table, I believe. Check out the Nag Hammadi Library. This is a trash dump in Egypt where we found tons of ancient scrolls. Or no, not a trash dump. Sorry. Wrong one. It was a jar in Nag Hammadi in the deserts of Egypt. It is a group of clay jars that were found buried in the sand that contained Gnostic scriptures. Yeah, it's really cool. Some of the Gnostic scriptures are almost Christian, and some are really far away from Christian. Just like a lot of other books that we'd find, some are really close and some are really not so close, and you wonder, what is the connection point here? So, yeah.
Second question I have is when Titus destroyed Jerusalem, would you say that really put a damper on the Jews converting to Christianity because the Jews were almost basically wiped out? Because you know that James and Peter were really hoping that it would be a continuation of the Jewish. But then Paul really took off and it became more of the pagan religion that took off, or the Gentile, not the pagan, but the Gentiles really took off. That the destruction of Jerusalem really hindered the growth of moving the Jews into Christianity.
So it does become a real problem. So in 70, with the destruction of the temple, it decentralized a lot of Jewish practice, and what we think of as Judaism with the synagogue and other things is kind of a Pharisaic Judaism, or at least the descendant of it. It's not a continuous line, but the descendants of a Pharisaic Judaism that they decentralized worship, which meant that Jews kind of spread. They didn't completely leave Judea. It wasn't until after the Bar Kokhba rebellion in, I think it was 130, where Rome just completely, they plowed Jerusalem under and they said, get out.
So that was 130.
That was 130. So there were still been Jews in the area that we think of as Palestine.
So it's 130 when they basically destroyed all of Jerusalem, animals included.
Yeah, pretty much everything. They just. It was later when it was, but this was the major event, and so Jews became much more reliant on the synagogue after that, which a synagogue is much more comparable to an early church. In fact, they were virtually the same in a lot of ways. A synagogue had to have 10 men in order to assemble. Otherwise, it was called a place of prayer. We see that in Acts, by the way. Paul goes to the place of prayer. That is a Jewish connection. I think we're talking Acts 17. Without looking that up, I'm not 100%. But a place of prayer was a place where Jews gathered to pray and worship, but it did not have 10 men, so it could not be called a synagogue. The synagogue would have been a house of worship, and because these became localized, and generally speaking, like Christians, you did not have too many buildings that were set aside as specifically synagogues. You would use houses or public buildings or wherever you could meet. It's kind of hard to find how many there were, where they were, because not every synagogue is going to have this nice mosaic tiled floor that tells us, oh, synagogue met here, or oh, this was a Christian church. You didn't advertise your presence quite that ambitiously like we would today. So we don't always know where the synagogues were. But yeah, that would have made things harder on Christians because it would have isolated Christians from Jews more. There still would have been Jewish conversions, but if I'm going out in my day-to-day work, in my day-to-day life, I'm going to try to convert the people who are around me. And suddenly, where somebody like Paul could go to a Jewish meeting place and go, okay, all the Jews are meeting here on Saturday, I'm going to go on Saturday and meet them. Suddenly, that second and third generation of Christians doesn't have quite that luxury necessarily. It's not going to be as public. They're going to have to go, okay, let's see if I can find them. And if I find them, the Jews are going to be a little wary of Christians coming in because they're now outsiders. So there's a whole dynamic. Yes, it would make converting Jews that much harder because they are destabilized and decentralized. Anything else? Nothing online, huh?
Good job.
Yeah. Well, if there's nothing else, thanks everybody for coming. This has been for me, it's been a great event. I'm hopeful that I hear back. If you watch on Facebook, let me know what you think, please. Send a message. Do something that lets me know that what you're going through. If we want to do this again, we'll pick up from about 500 and go through. So, if nothing else, thanks for coming, and I'll see you next time.